The first whispers began in hushed tones, tucked away in corners of online forums and gossip sites where rumors often spread unchecked. But this time, the chatter had an edge of credibility that made people lean in closer. At the center of it all was Barron Trump, the youngest son of Donald and Melania Trump. While most of the world had watched him grow up from a distance, carefully shielded from the media spotlight by his mother, suddenly his name was tied to something deeply personal: DNA results that no one expected to become public. The circumstances around how those results surfaced remained murky. Some claimed they had been leaked by someone inside the medical community, others insisted it was the result of a hack, and a few pointed to political rivals who might have had every reason to stir controversy. Regardless of the source, the fact remained that private medical information, the kind no one would ever want out in the open, was suddenly being whispered about in Washington circles. What made this situation even more shocking was the way the story started to grow legs. Reporters, who had long avoided mentioning Barron out of respect for his age, began to hint that there was something interesting about a document being passed around Capitol Hill. A few reckless commentators pushed the envelope further, suggesting that the DNA report carried implications that could cast shadows on the Trump family's carefully constructed image. Every mention, every vague reference, fueled more speculation, making the story feel less like gossip and more like a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. For Barron himself, the leak meant being pulled into the spotlight in a way he had never been before. Throughout his childhood and teenage years, Melania had fiercely protected him, ensuring that cameras stayed away and that he was granted more privacy than most political children ever received. Yet here he was, suddenly the subject of national conversation, not for anything he had said or done, but because of medical results that should have remained locked in a private file. It was a cruel kind of exposure, one that stripped away the very thing his mother had worked so hard to preserve. The whispers soon became louder when political figures began to weigh in. Some called the leak a disgrace, pointing out that no child, regardless of who his parents were, should have to endure such an invasion of privacy. Others, however, seized on the opportunity, eager to weaponize the situation. They implied that the results revealed something the public had a right to know, though they rarely specified exactly what that was. It was a strategy designed to keep the public guessing, dangling the idea that there was some secret hidden within Barron's DNA that could shake the Trump household. As the narrative spread, the implications became more layered. Was the leak a calculated move to damage Donald Trump politically? Was it an attack aimed at Melania, who had long projected herself as the calm, protective pillar of the family? Or was it, as some claimed, nothing more than a careless breach of confidentiality that spiraled out of control once political figures got their hands on it? Each possibility carried weight, but none changed the fact that Barron himself had been unwillingly thrust into the spotlight. In conversations behind closed doors, allies of the family were reportedly scrambling, trying to figure out how to contain the damage. Lawyers were mentioned, lawsuits were discussed, and there was even talk of investigating how the information had been obtained in the first place. Meanwhile, opponents of the Trumps hinted that more information might come, feeding a sense of anticipation that kept the story alive in the media cycle. For those who followed politics closely, the sudden focus on Barron felt like crossing a line. Even in the most heated of political battles, children were usually considered off-limits. But now, with DNA results being talked about openly, it was clear that the unspoken rules of respect had been broken. The story no longer lived in the shadows of rumor, it was out in the open, messy and unavoidable, with Barron Trump's name at the center of it all. When the news of the DNA results began to swirl, the reaction inside the Trump household was one of shock, confusion, and then a surge of anger that centered around Melania Trump. More than anyone else, she had made it her life's mission to keep Barron out of the spotlight, protecting him from the relentless attention that followed his father everywhere. For years, she had managed to succeed, creating a protective barrier around her son that very few could penetrate. But with this sudden breach, the one thing she had always feared became reality. Barron's name was now being dragged into public debate, attached to whispers and speculation that had no business being discussed outside the privacy of a family home. Those close to her described Melania's response as explosive. She was said to be livid when she first saw the details of what had been leaked. Not only did she feel that Barron's trust had been violated, but she also felt that her own role as protector had been undermined. To her, the leak wasn't just about a document, it was about her son's dignity and the years of effort she had invested in shielding him from the often cruel world of politics and media. It was one thing for political opponents to go after Donald Trump, a man who had built his life in the public eye, but it was another thing entirely to target Barron, who had never asked for that kind of attention. Melania's anger reportedly grew when she began to understand how widespread the situation had become. This wasn't a case of one rumor slipping through the cracks, this was information being circulated, analyzed, and weaponized by those who knew it could cause maximum damage. She was furious at the idea that people were willing to use Barron's personal information as a political tool. For her, that crossed a boundary so sacred that she could not remain silent. Her response behind closed doors was said to be filled with sharp words and heated demands. She questioned how something so private could ever have been released and who stood to gain from it. Melania was not the type to lash out publicly in an uncontrolled way, but those who saw her in private described her as deeply unsettled and uncharacteristically outspoken. She expressed frustration not only at those outside the family but at the very institutions that were supposed to protect sensitive information. How could medical records tied to her son have found their way into the hands of political figures and media insiders? To her, it was more than betrayal, it was a violation of trust on a national scale. Barron himself, caught in the middle, became an even greater source of Melania's fury. She could see the toll the situation might take on him. At an age where most young people are struggling to find their own identity, he was now being forced into a role he never wanted, becoming a symbol in a political firestorm not of his making. Melania's protective instincts, always strong, were now heightened to the point where every comment and every article felt like a personal attack on her child. Her anger was not limited to the leak itself but also to the way opponents and commentators seemed to revel in it. When figures like Jasmine Crockett began speaking openly about the results, treating them as political ammunition, Melania's outrage only deepened. She reportedly saw it as cruel and heartless, a willingness to sacrifice Barron's right to privacy for the sake of headlines and political points. For Melania, this was not politics anymore, this was about her son, a young man who had been unfairly pulled into a storm he had no control over. Friends and allies said Melania made it clear that she would not stand idly by while Barron's name was exploited. Though she rarely inserted herself into the center of political controversies, this was different. This was about family. Her anger became a driving force, motivating her to demand accountability and to insist that boundaries be respected. Those who underestimated her resolve quickly realized that Melania, when it came to Barron, was willing to fight with a ferocity that left little room for compromise. In private, she reportedly vented about the unfairness of it all, the way political life had already taken so much from her family, and now it threatened to take away her son's sense of security as well. Every parent's worst fear is seeing their child exposed to harm, and for Melania, that fear had manifested in the form of a national scandal. It wasn't just anger at what had been revealed, it was the rage of a mother who felt the most precious part of her life had been dragged through the mud without reason. When Jasmine Crockett stepped forward to speak about the situation, she did so with the kind of energy that had already made her a recognizable figure in political circles. Known for her sharp tongue and unwillingness to back down, Crockett quickly positioned herself at the center of the storm surrounding the leaked DNA results. While many were cautious about even mentioning Barron Trump by name, Crockett decided to do the opposite. She brought him into the spotlight with a bluntness that shocked her critics and energized her supporters. Her decision to expose what she framed as the truth was not without controversy. Some questioned whether it was appropriate to involve Barron at all, arguing that he was still young and had never chosen public life. But Crockett countered that the results carried significance that could not be ignored. Standing before cameras, she pieced together a narrative, claiming that the Trump family had worked to keep these results hidden and that the public had every right to know what was being concealed. In doing so, she cast Barron not just as a private citizen but as a symbol of what she argued was larger secrecy within the Trump household. Crockett's words cut sharply. She didn't mince them, either. She referenced the DNA leak directly, making it clear that the story was no longer just whispered speculation but something she was willing to validate publicly. The way she spoke about Barron, framing him as an unwilling figure in what she described as a cover-up, struck a nerve with audiences across the country. For some, her boldness felt refreshing, proof that she was unafraid to challenge one of the most powerful families in America. For others, her actions crossed a line, dragging a teenager into the brutal arena of politics where even seasoned adults struggled to survive. What made her exposure even more impactful was the way she connected it to broader issues. Crockett painted a picture of a family that wanted to control information at all costs, even when it concerned someone as young as Barron. She framed the leak as evidence that transparency was being buried beneath layers of secrecy. In her telling, the DNA results weren't just about one individual, they were about accountability, trust, and the lengths to which the Trump family would allegedly go to keep certain truths from emerging. Her remarks sent shockwaves through political media. Overnight, Barron's name became a trending topic, attached to headlines that dissected every word Crockett had said. Talk shows debated whether she had gone too far. Newspapers published opinion pieces arguing both sides of the issue, some praising her courage to speak openly, others condemning what they saw as an unnecessary and damaging invasion into a young man's private life. Whatever side people fell on, there was no denying that Crockett had forced the story into the mainstream in a way no one else had dared to do. For Barron, the exposure was devastating in a quieter, more personal way. Suddenly, he was no longer just the reserved son who stayed out of the limelight, he was a central figure in a national controversy. His name, which had once been mentioned sparingly in the media, was now attached to one of the most heated debates in politics. Melania's fears had come true, the protective wall she had built around her son had been pierced, and Jasmine Crockett was the one holding the hammer. Crockett, however, showed no signs of backing down. If anything, the pushback only emboldened her further. She doubled down on her claims, insisting that she was standing up for transparency and that the American people deserved to know the whole story, no matter how uncomfortable it made the Trump family. To her, the issue wasn't Barron as an individual but what his situation revealed about the people around him. She argued that if a family in such a position of power could manipulate or conceal information about something as personal as DNA, then what else might they be hiding? That framing kept her in the headlines, but it also intensified the backlash. Critics accused her of exploiting Barron for political gain, of crossing ethical lines that even the fiercest opponents of the Trumps had respected. Allies, on the other hand, praised her as fearless, saying she was willing to confront taboos in order to reveal the truth. The division mirrored the broader polarization in the country, but now Barron's name had been pulled into the center of it. Crockett's exposure of the results became a turning point in the entire saga. It shifted the narrative from private whispers to public confrontation. By choosing to speak out so directly and repeatedly, she ensured that Barron would remain a part of the conversation, whether his family liked it or not. And in doing so, she transformed what could have been a short-lived leak into a lasting controversy that weighed heavily on both him. The uproar over Barron Trump's DNA leak quickly became more than a family matter. What began as an invasion of privacy soon turned into a fierce debate that touched on some of the most sensitive issues in American public life, where the line should be drawn between private family matters and the demands of political transparency. On one side were those who argued that Barron should have been left completely out of the conversation. On the other side were figures like Jasmine Crockett, who claimed that the situation revealed broader truths that the public deserved to know. The clash of those two perspectives gave the controversy a life of its own, making Barron a symbol of a larger cultural battle he had never asked to be part of. For years, Melania Trump had fought to keep her son shielded from the glare of the spotlight. She believed fiercely in his right to grow up without being turned into a pawn in political games. Many Americans sympathized with her, pointing out that children of public figures should not be dragged into scandals created by adults. When the DNA results were leaked, that sympathy deepened. Commentators noted that no young person should have to see their most personal information debated on television or dissected in political speeches. For those observers, the idea of attaching Barron's name to arguments about transparency felt cruel and unnecessary. But transparency advocates made a different case. They insisted that the Trump family, given its position of power and influence, could not demand the same level of privacy as ordinary citizens. Jasmine Crockett amplified this point by suggesting that the DNA results, while sensitive, revealed more than just medical details. She hinted that they were part of a bigger picture about secrecy and the way the family managed information. By drawing Barron into that narrative, Crockett effectively turned the story from a private leak into a public controversy framed as a battle between accountability and privilege. The tension between these two perspectives only grew as the story gained momentum. Supporters of the Trumps accused their opponents of weaponizing Barron's identity, using his personal life to score political points. They asked where the line would be drawn if even a teenager's private records could be exploited for headlines. Opponents countered that the public had a right to know if there were truths being hidden, no matter how uncomfortable those truths might be. The result was a standoff that blurred the line between protecting a child and exposing a family's secrets. For Barron himself, this tug-of-war created a heavy and unfair burden. While adults debated the principles of privacy versus transparency, his name continued to circulate in ways he could not control. Every mention of him became tied to the larger battle, reducing him to a symbol rather than a person. To some, he was the innocent victim of an unjust leak. To others, he was evidence of what they described as the Trump family's lack of openness. Either way, his identity was being defined by forces outside of his control. The media, as always, played a significant role in deepening the debate. Some outlets took care to frame the issue delicately, focusing on the ethical dilemma rather than on Barron himself. Others leaned into the sensational angle, running stories that dissected the leak in ways that made his privacy seem even more compromised. Each article, each televised panel, seemed to widen the gulf between those demanding protection for him and those demanding transparency from his family. Even within political circles, the controversy sparked division. Some Democrats privately admitted that they were uncomfortable with Crockett's decision to speak so directly about Barron, worrying that it could backfire and create sympathy for the Trumps. Others, however, saw it as a bold move that forced uncomfortable truths into the open. Republicans, meanwhile, rallied around the idea that family should be off-limits, pointing to the situation as proof that opponents were willing to go too far in their attempts to damage Donald Trump. This clash of perspectives highlighted a deeper issue in American politics, the balance between personal rights and public scrutiny. If Barron's DNA results could be leaked and dissected, what did that say about the boundaries of privacy for anyone connected to powerful figures? Could the children of politicians ever truly be protected, or were they destined to become collateral damage in political battles? These questions lingered in the background of every debate, making the situation about far more than just one family's crisis. In the end, the controversy surrounding Barron's DNA leak became a case study in the blurred lines between family and politics. He had never chosen to be in the spotlight, yet he was forced into it because of circumstances beyond his control. The debate about privacy versus transparency raged on, but the reality was that Barron remained at the center of a storm that revealed just how far political opponents and media figures were willing to go, and just how fragile the boundary between public and private life had become. The story of Barron Trump's DNA leak and the chaos that followed eventually came to symbolize more than just a scandal involving one family. It became a window into the state of American politics, media, and the public's appetite for controversy. What began as a private matter quickly transformed into a national conversation, not because of anything Barron himself had done, but because his name and his identity were woven into a tug-of-war between opposing forces. On one side stood Melania, a mother whose anger and heartbreak revealed the depth of her devotion to her son. On the other stood figures like Jasmine Crockett, who insisted that transparency was worth the cost, even if it meant pushing boundaries that most people believed should remain untouched. As the debates unfolded, it was clear that the real issue was not the DNA itself but what it represented. To some, it was a symbol of how far political opponents would go to gain leverage, even if it meant targeting a child. To others, it was evidence of how the Trump family had allegedly hidden information in ways that demanded exposure. Barron's name became shorthand for the larger battle between privacy and transparency, innocence and accountability, family protection and political exploitation. The clash highlighted just how fragile the balance had become in a country where almost nothing remains private once it touches politics. What struck many observers most was the unfairness of Barron's situation. Unlike his father, he had never sought power or influence. Unlike his mother, he had not chosen the spotlight. He was a teenager who had lived much of his life shielded from public attention, only to be pulled into the center of a storm he could not control. For Melania, this was the deepest wound of all, the realization that no matter how carefully she tried to protect him, there were forces willing to breach that wall for the sake of headlines or political advantage. Her anger was not only personal but maternal, rooted in the universal instinct to defend a child from harm. Yet, as much as Melania's fury resonated with many, Crockett's determination also found its audience. She tapped into a deep skepticism about power and secrecy, framing her exposure of the results as a stand for honesty in a political world often defined by concealment. Whether people agreed with her or not, she succeeded in forcing the conversation, ensuring that the leak could not simply be swept aside or ignored. In the end, the saga left behind more questions than answers. Where should the line be drawn when it comes to the children of public figures? Should privacy always take precedence, or are there circumstances where transparency demands a higher price? And perhaps most importantly, what does it say about the culture of politics when a young man like Barron becomes a battleground for debates he never asked to be part of? The answers to those questions remain uncertain. What is clear, however, is that the events surrounding the leak left a lasting impact. They revealed the vulnerabilities that come with power, the cruelty that can emerge in public life, and the resilience of a family determined to protect one of its own. Barron Trump may not have chosen the spotlight, but through no fault of his own, he became the center of a controversy that will be remembered as one of the most unsettling intersections of family, politics,